The AFP's role, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is to investigate breaches of Commonwealth criminal law. We investigate laws passed by the Parliament, using powers granted to us by the Parliament. Our investigations are an objective search for the truth. It involves the discovery and presentation of evidence in an exhaustive, comprehensive and organised manner. And this often includes the execution of search warrants. No sector of the community should be immune for this type of activity or evidence collection more broadly. This includes law enforcement itself, the media, or indeed even politicians. There are criminal allegations being investigated and we cannot ignore them. We are duty-bound to conduct these investigations impartially and thoroughly. Not to do so would be a breach of our oath of office as police officers. These search warrants were authorised by an appropriate member of the judiciary. This is a result of supporting documentation being presented to the court which provides sufficient suspicion that a criminal offence has been committed and evidential material is likely to be found at certain locations. The execution of these search warrants and the timing of these search warrants was a considered decision aimed at lawfully locating evidence and seizing that evidence in a manner which will withstand the scrutiny of a court of law. The collection of evidence and investigation process undertaken by my staff and police more broadly in the AFP and indeed across the state and territory jurisdictions when conducting investigations must be done in accordance with the law. Throughout the execution of the search warrants, in collaboration with the people affected, the AFP in these particular matters took additional care to protect the confidentiality of other personal or professional information that was not subjected to the warrant. Both of these investigations relate to national security information, how it was handled and who had access to it. The material subject of these investigations and search warrants relates to documents classified as both top secret and secret. The compromise of such material could cause exceptionally grave damage or serious damage to the national interests, organisations or indeed individuals. The point of difference with these two particular investigations, or the most particular point of difference, is parts of the document were actually published. I need to emphasise in the strongest possible terms that not the government nor any minister has directed the actions of these investigations. As a standard practice, the AFP notified the Minister's office it was investigating these matters at the time these matters were referred to the AFP. We did not provide regular updates on operational activities, nor did we tell them we had obtained search warrants and planned to execute these warrants. Notification of the search warrants being executed occurred after the activity had commenced. This was an operational decision and in accordance with our governance and standard practice. These investigations are typically complex and lengthy. The timing of these investigations or these activities was influenced only by the progress of the investigation to date and sufficient information being available to support the application of a search warrant. Any inference that suggests our decisions were influenced by anyone else outside the organisation is strongly refuted. I reject the claim over the last few days that we are trying to intimidate journalists or conduct a campaign against the media. The AFP is a strong supporter of press freedom. The media plays an important role in today's society in keeping the Australian community informed. And finally, and probably as importantly as anything else I've said, I'd like to state that my members over the last few days have been subjected to unprecedented scrutiny in relation to these particular matters. They have my strongest support for their actions and their activities. They have acted professionally and respectfully under challenging circumstances, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Acting Commissioner, can you confirm that by adding the words add, copy, delete, alter in warrants, including the one that was executed on the ABC, it gives the AFP the capacity to hack computers, sometimes remotely without people knowing, and then removing that capacity later?
No, it doesn't. And I'll explain why that's actually been added. I think it's a very good question, certainly one that I think is worthy of some discussion, noting that it has been discussed at length in the media today. Obviously, we operate now in a very technological savvy environment. Every time we execute search warrants, we are doing so because people have iPhones and the like. If we access a document, say on your phone, as soon as we access that, by the very nature of accessing it, we have altered it. If we copy it and we move it somewhere else, we have altered it. We've altered the metadata. The reason why that particular clause has been added to the legislation is so that when we seize the document, it is altered. It is altered. But the inference that we can remotely alter documentation, or that we can change the way things are presented in their real sense, is totally refuted. And I might add that particularly in relation to these particular search warrants, we have seized documentation that is currently locked down. That being that it is in the hands of the investigators, and we have signed an undertaking with the lawyers of both the ABC and News Corp that we will not talk about those matters, we will not look at those particular files or those documentation until such time as the lawyers from those relevant agencies and the lawyers from the AFP have gone through and looked at the privilege issue. And clearly at that stage, if there is any inference that there's been alteration of documents, that will be disclosed at that time. But I really refute the fact that the legislation has enabled us to do that. I think I've explained why the legislation's been changed. Now, we're operating in an extremely complex environment, and I think that the legislation sometimes needs to keep pace with it, and we'll do our best in relation to ensuring that.
Sorry,
No.
were you planning other raids, and have they been put on hold?
Look, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow description in relation to where the investigation's at, and I think in fairness, nor would you expect me to. The investigation is complex, it is ongoing. Potentially, yes, we may do more search warrants, but again, as I said earlier, the legislation we are operating on here is extremely complex, and as such, we're required to examine what we're doing in a very thoughtful way. And if we determine it appropriate to execute more search warrants in relation to this investigation, we will do so without fear or favour. Chris?
Thank you, Commissioner. Who is the subject of your investigation? Who could be liable for prosecution? Could the organisations or journalists be liable for prosecution?
Well, again, I think it's important to say at this phase that we are in the evidence collection phase of the investigation. Now, clearly, we've got a long way to go, but certainly in relation to we've got a person before the court already. It's in the public domain in relation to what's been referred to as the Afghan files matter. That matter's ongoing. I'm not going to rule in or rule out anyone being subjected to further charges. I think that's inappropriate.
Just a clarification though, it can be a crime to publish this material, can't it?
Look, it can be, but I think we also need to, Chris, here in relation to this particular issue, we need to look at the public interest issue. And I think, I'm going to raise that because I'm sure you people are going to at some stage. Public interest is something that we look at in relation to our investigations from the outset. And it's something that we will consider in the course of producing our brief of evidence. I might also add that it's in the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution's guideline in relation to whether or not they could commence a prosecution based on public interest. So we've got two, fairly in-depth things that we need to overcome before we go down that path. But I think, you guys have read the legislation. You guys understand exactly the potential possibility, but it is an offence to actually have that particular material still on websites. Yes, it is.
Acting Commissioner, you've chosen to reveal to us a couple of instances where there was contact with the executive government, specifically at the outset of the investigations. Given you can reveal that much, can you tell us how much, if any, contact there has been with members of the executive on these two investigations over the intervening period, up to 2 years, or are you saying today there was no other contact with the executive before those warrants were issued?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And look, this is not unusual in relation to these type of investigations. We are required under our national guideline to inform the minister when we receive investigations of this nature. We undertook that. But it's also important to note that, sensitive investigations such as this, we utilise a fair amount of discretion not to brief the minister, or the minister's office, I should say. And that's the undertaking in this particular instance.
So
keep going, go on.
So from the outset of the investigation, no member of the executive or their staff was briefed or updated in any way on either investigation.
That's correct.
You saw the warrant for the ABC action through a court registrar in Nowra. Why would you seek the warrant through a court registrar in Nowra instead of a magistrate or judge in Sydney or Canberra?
Look, important question, and I think that it's one that I'm happy to answer. Now, in the ACT, we certainly obtained the warrant from the magistrate, which is in accordance with the judicial process that exists within the Australian Capital Territory. In New South Wales, the judicial process is different in that the warrants are issued by court registrars. So in this instance, we actually attended Queanbeyan Local Court in New South Wales, and we obtained the warrant from the registrar there, who also acts in a capacity in Nowra.
What's the alleged harm to national security in these cases, and why doesn't the Australian public have a right to know about plans to increase spying or alleged unlawful killing?
Well, what we're investigating is the fact that code-worded and top secret and secret information was disclosed to the Australian community. The substance of that is to our investigation process is somewhat irrelevant. The issue of whether or not the public has a right to know is really not an issue that comes into our investigation process. We're given a complaint in these instances by secretaries of other departments. We look at the criminality and then we investigate that. Now, we're not going to make a judgment, and nor should we make a judgment, and indeed nor can we make a judgment in relation to whether a referral is a good referral or a bad referral. But in this particular instance, it was deemed that a likelihood of an offence being committed had been done so, and therefore we commenced an investigation.
On that point, picking up from Paul, you mentioned in your opening remarks about how these documents had been published.
Yes.
Can you explain why that is so different? If these documents actually hadn't been published in papers and on websites, would that perhaps suggest that these cases may not have gone ahead?
No, I didn't say that, and I didn't say that. I think what's important to note that what sets these two, if you like, above others is the fact that the information was published online or in the newspaper, as the case may be. It doesn't take away from the fact that it was still a breach of the national security guidelines in that top secret and secret information had been released by a member of Commonwealth employment to a member of the media.
Commissioner, you mentioned that these investigations can be lengthy, but surely waiting so long before conducting a raid would increase the probability that the evidence is misplaced or destroyed, wouldn't it?
I think one thing I will start at the outset is they're search warrants, not raids, and even if we look at the Macquarie Dictionary, we'll see that raid has a certain connotation, which I find in relation to these particular issues not quite right. So, but in relation to the gathering of a search warrant takes a fair amount of time. It's not a simple matter of just deciding to do a search warrant. There's a fairly lengthy evidence collection phase before we go to the fact of executing a search warrant. And I will say that the execution of a search warrant in itself isn't necessarily the finalisation of the investigation. There are other things that we will continue to do. So, if you like, it's a continuum that may change. Sometimes a search warrant will be very early, sometimes it'll be in the middle of the investigation, and indeed sometimes the execution of a search warrant will be at the end. So the timing of the execution of the search warrant is really irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the evidence that we obtained during the execution of the search warrants was also electronic, and an electronic footprint is much more difficult to remove than a piece of paper.
Chris. Take you back to something you said a little bit earlier, because you were finishing when you said it is an offence to have this material on websites. So can I take you back to that again? So a crime, therefore, has been committed by the media organisations. Is it your intention to prosecute the journalists?
We haven't made a decision one way or the other.
But is it the crime has been committed? In your view, that crime of having that material on the website has been committed?
We will need to go through the process of proving the elements of the offence. One of the critical issues for us is who's responsible for the uploading of that document on the computer, when it was done, etc., etc. So there's a fairly significant process. But it also I did speak about public interest. And the fact of the matter is, regardless of where our investigation leads us to, there's a number of other steps that need to take place before we get to the phase that we're actually putting someone before the court. And I think that's being lost. The search warrant is a part of the process. It's a very minute part of the process, indeed, but indeed it's a public part of the process. So whilst the collection of information is still ongoing, we can't lose sight of the fact that we've got a long way to go.
The Attorney General yesterday said Annika Smethurst was not the subject of investigation per se, based on your answers to Chris. So you said that she could still face criminal prosecution. Was the Attorney General wrong to say that yesterday?
No, because the way that the search warrants were crafted under the old legislation is indeed the Attorney General is correct. The new legislation, which was put in place towards the end of last year, means that the publication of those things is an offence. So we're probably not going to look at that particular offence in this instance.
Commissioner, one of these cases is 2 years old, the other is 14 months old, and you served these warrants on 2 successive days, 3 weeks after a federal election. Are you asking us to take that as entirely coincidental?
Well, the execution of the search warrants in 2 consecutive days is not coincidental. That was planned. Let's be very clear on that. But I'll get to that. The timing of the search warrants is irrelevant. I think that we would be having this press conference in relation to this particular activity, whether we executed the search warrants before the election, during the election campaign, or indeed after what we are now. The reason it was done consecutively was simply a matter of resourcing. I needed a number of investigators for both search warrants, and more importantly, I needed digital forensics capability. Now, obviously, the AFP is a complex organisation. We do large-scale investigations. Obviously, this is part of it, but we also do counter-terrorism investigations, child protection, serious and organised crime. And to corral those resources for 2 full days, 4 digital forensic people, is quite difficult. So I'm still going. Thank you. The issue for me was that this operation has taken a number of months to get to the phase where we are today, and the suggestion that the timing from my perspective is irrelevant. I honestly believe we would be having this discussion regardless of when I executed the search warrants.
But just to follow that question, can you please tell us, did you or the AFP, any of your officers, take into account the timing of the federal election in deciding when to apply and execute the search warrants? And just a second to that, you say your officers took extra care in executing these warrants. How does rifling through the underwear drawer of a female reporter constitute taking extra care?
Okay, I'll try and answer both of those, and if I fail, please pick me up and I'll come back to it. The timing, as I said, I understand why people are saying that the timing is suspicious or fishy or whatever the term is, but for me the timing was about quarantining those resources to ensure that we were able to do the execution of the search warrants in an expedient manner to ensure that the integrity of the investigation wasn't lost. As I said, the ability for us to get the digital forensics resources ready to go is not an easy one. Noting the fact that my resources are also being used on national security investigations such as terrorism, organised crime, etc. In relation to the conduct of the search warrant in Ms Smethurst's house, we were looking for USBs. USBs by their nature are quite small and are quite easily to conceal on different locations. That's why the search was conducted in accordance with our standard procedure, in that we would always search those particular locations. Now, we ensured, due to her privacy, etc., that when that search of that particular location in her house was undertaken, it was done by 2 female officers. One reason why the search warrant took so long, both at her house and also at the ABC, is we were very, very careful in relation to the execution of the search warrant that we ensured that we were only targeting the information that was relevant to the search warrant. Only relevant to the search warrant. Now, you could, same with all your phones and all your tablets, I'm sure there's other very sensitive information on there that you would not like in the public domain. The reason why it took us so long is the fact that we made it very clear with her assistance and her lawyer's assistance to ensure we only targeted bits relevant to the warrant, and the rest of the information we haven't. Andrew?
Can you confirm that before you executed the search warrant, you also executed journalist warrants to access metadata from either or all of Annika Smethurst and the ABC journalists?
Look, I asked that question this morning and I was advised we did not. But if that is incorrect, we will correct the record. But my advice this morning was we did not use journalist warrants in relation to this matter.
Further on the ABC, you've already said that you've been investigating this for many, many months. why didn't you continue your legal letters with the ABC and seek to resolve this by subpoena rather than through the theatre and optics of a raid, or to use your terminology, execution of a search warrant?
No, it's a good question, and I think I'm glad you raised it. We've been in negotiation, we were in negotiation with the ABC for a considerable period of time in relation to the execution of the search warrant on their location. We received advice from their legal counsel in March of this year that they were of the view that they were no longer going to assist us, and we were at loggerheads. We were of the view, based on the fact that we didn't see a way forward, that the only way to continue the investigation was to execute the search warrant as we did yesterday. I might add that the only way it was turned into a public display was based on what the ABC did when we arrived yesterday. Now, they knew we were coming. It was a warrant by consent, for want of a better term. Agreed time for my officers to attend the location and undertake the search warrant, which they did. And the ABC filmed it, which is their right. And they continued to tweet during the execution of the search warrant, which again is their right. And I think that goes to show the fact that, the fact that that was allowed to occur without any hindrance whatsoever does show the AFP supports freedom of the press. Yes, mate.
Explain the rationale behind starting your ABC search warrants at head offices as opposed to with Annika Smethurst turning her apartment upside down?
Look, that goes into the methodology. Sorry, that goes into the sequence of the investigation. The investigations are slightly different. I'm not going to give you a song and dance in relation to why we do things in a certain order, but there, as I said, there are other strategies at play here in relation to these particular matters that dictated the order in which we do things. And as I said, we believe through a thorough investigation, through a very strong investigation plan which was put in place in relation to these matters, that was the appropriate course of conduct on this instance.
Can you confirm that even receipt of these documents would be a crime, and how can we have freedom of the press if...
Sorry, can you ask... I missed the first part.
Can you confirm that even receiving these documents would be a crime, and how can we have freedom of the press if that's the case?
Well, it's not a crime in itself, depending on the circumstances with which it took place. And I might add, even it's not directly relevant, but it is relevant to some extent. There is a public interest disclosure regime which exists across the Commonwealth for public servants, and indeed any members of the public that may wish to prevail themselves of that. We've investigated many similar matters over the course of the last few years where people have availed themselves of the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and as such, the AFP has not proceeded with any action. The two persons involved in this investigation who are alleged, and I do use the word alleged strongly, were involved in the disclosure of the material to journalists, did not avail themselves of the PID. That is still a matter for people to perform whistleblower activity for utilisation of the PID, but I think it's incumbent upon me also to say that it's important that people realise the reason why we are so strongly in our view of certainly protecting top secret and secret information is that the Australian government, or particularly the Australian law enforcement intelligence communities, rely on secret and top secret information from our international partners, particularly Five Eyes partners, to ensure the fact that we keep the Australian community safe. Now, if we can't be seen to protect our own internal information, we are concerned that the information flow to us dries up, and that's the factor about it.
In regards to the ABC, if you knew the source of the information already in regards to David McBride, why did you need to go into the ABC to determine that source, and how is that not just a show of force designed to intimidate the media and stop other whistleblowers from coming forward?
Look, I disagree with the premise, but I understand where you're coming from. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the views of the journalists in relation to this particular issue, but we're in a different prism here. I mean, I'm trusted as a senior official of the law enforcement agency to execute lawful execution of powers. Now, if it's an issue in relation to the law, and we think the law's inappropriate, well, then we need to change the law. But as the law stands at the moment, we have to execute it. Now, as far as executing the search warrant with a number of police officers, all dressed in plain clothes, by appointment, I don't think that's intimidation.
Whether they're wearing plain clothes or not, it's a show of force to go in and do what you were doing, was it not?
No, I disagree. I think the fact is that it was done through appointment. They knew we were coming. I don't agree it's a use of force.
People wearing plain clothes and intimidating.
Well, we're going to agree to disagree.
How many leak investigations of leaks to the media in the last 3 years have been to the AFP, referred to the AFP? And given your point about resources and things like counter-terrorism, we're in a heightened threat environment, is it really the police's best use of time to conduct these sorts of hunts?
Look, we get numerous leaking referrals to us, and to be honest, we get too many. But as I said, the premise of us investigating these matters is to ensure that the international community knows that we take the leaking of information, sensitive information, seriously. Because if we don't take it seriously, it closes down an avenue of people providing the Australian community or the Australian intelligence and law enforcement agencies very sensitive information, which ultimately does save lives. I can't stress that enough.
Have you advised Annika Smethurst, Samuel Clark or Daniel Oakes that they could face criminal prosecution as a result of your investigations going forward?
Look, I don't know what the investigators said during the course of the search warrant, so it would be inappropriate for me to make that comment.
On your earlier answer to the question about the timing, I appreciate what you've said about resourcing and specialist skills being available at the right time, but can you please say whether the timing of the election was ever a factor in your decision on the timing of seeking and executing the warrants? And you said to Tim earlier that the AFP never updated the government or anyone in the executive about the investigation. Can you tell us, did anyone from the government or any department heads contact the AFP seeking an update?
Certainly, the timing is... I made the decision of timing. That was my decision in my substantive position. No, I did not. Did not factor in the election. In relation to notifications of government, I can assure you there were no updates. In relation to updates of secretaries of government agencies, to the best of my... Certainly I did not update them, but I'd have to be careful here because I would be surprised if our investigators at some stage did not have some conversations with the referring agencies, as I would expect.
Are you still investigating?
Can I just ask you, it strikes me that a story about the behaviour of our SAS troops abroad that might have involved the murder of innocents and a discussion of whether one of our agencies might be retasked to spy on Australian citizens are of prime public importance. Are you saying that the public interest would have been better served had those two pieces of journalism not appeared?
No, I'm not. I've never said that. What I'm saying is we have investigated a criminal offence, and I think I said at the outset, and correct me if I didn't, that we're investigating the criminality. Now, the issue of public interest is a matter that we do consider, and I have said that we consider that at various phases through the investigation. I will also say that in relation to one of those matters in particular, there is also some very sensitive personal information that has found its way into the hands of people who probably shouldn't have it. And I'm concerned about that, as are those individual members. So we've got to take in consideration, as I said as well, individual privacy here is paramount as well.
So where will the merit of these stories be factored in, Assistant Commissioner, and how? Where and how will the merit of the public merit of the stories be weighed?
Look, it's a good question, and I think the public interest, as I've said, is part of the consideration that we do during the course of our investigation. If we determine there is sufficient evidence to run a prosecution, and we've got a long way to go before we get there, it is then a consideration of the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution before they determine whether or not it's in the public interest to prosecute. And ultimately, if they decide it is, then it's a matter for the judiciary. So there is a three-step process. We investigate many crimes in the AFP where we know there could be a defence immediately. I use the example of common assault. When we investigate a common assault, we know in the back of our mind immediately that a thing such as self-defence is immediately could be proven or could be waived. It doesn't stop us from investigating the matter. What I'm trying to get my point across here is that we're in the process of investigation, we're in the process of discovery, we're in the process of evidence collection. We've got a long way to go before we get to the stage of a prosecution or a brief of evidence. Andrew.
Are you still investigating the curious leak of some ASIO advice, cabinet-level ASIO advice, to the Australian newspaper earlier this year?
I honestly don't have the answer to that question.
Do you agree
Last question.
Do you agree that it's peculiar that no people holding public office or politicians, have been the subject of search warrants in relation to the previous cabinet leaks?
No. I mean, as I said, we follow an investigative process, and in those particular instances, during the course of the investigation, we deemed it wasn't necessary to undertake search warrants.
Given Mr McBride has sort of openly admits that he has handed documents to the ABC journalist's name on the warrant yesterday, why did the AFP feel it necessary to go into the ABC and do that? What sort of link are you establishing there, whether the accused person who's been committed to trial says, yep, there is a link, it was me?
Well, I think in relation to that one, we still have to follow the evidence trail. We still need to ensure that just because someone says they did something doesn't mean they actually did. So there's still a fair way.
To a crime.
People do it. Surprisingly, people actually do it quite regularly. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Last one.
That's too early for us to tell. The investigation's still ongoing, so we've still got a way to go before we can cost it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.